Well, Philip, thanks for joining us. And so just to begin with, how realistic at this present moment in time are the 2020 EU targets on energy emissions reduction, renewable energy deployment and energy efficiency? And is it a failure if they are met through certain countries overachieving and a not inconsiderable number of countries underachieving?
Well, I think it's obvious that the renewable story in Europe has been a success as far as 2020 is concerned. It is a success, will be a success. It is obviously important to build up the share of renewable energy and low carbon energy everywhere in Europe. But if we have an interconnected, integrated Europe, the issue of actually where the electricity is generated is less of a concern. Mm-hmm. So that's a big success, I think, for Europe, and it has industrial policy implications too for the countries concerned, the technologies which they have been developing, thanks to, with collaboration, for example, with manufacture of solar panels in China and elsewhere, is keeping Europe in the vanguard of developments in renewable technologies, even though China and the US are catching up. Now on emissions, well, you can say that yes, we're likely to achieve the 2020 target. However, a large contribution to that has come through the economic recession. Mm-hmm. And so we still have to look very carefully at whether what has been done to change structures in the energy systems in Europe is sufficient to keep us on a pathway to the objectives for 2050. And there we've got a considerable amount of work to do, as I indicated in the lecture. On energy efficiency, we are not alone in the world in talking a lot about it, but not doing enough about it. The member states of the European Union governments were reluctant to adopt the same approach as for renewables and have binding targets at national level for improvements in the use of energy. So they said to us, well, why don't you propose some measures which will have equivalent effect? At the moment, we don't look as if we will achieve the 20% improvement by 2020. Without new measures, we'll only achieve 10% improvement. And we've made some proposals in summer last year. I have to say the member states don't like binding measures either. They don't like binding targets, they don't like binding measures. But I think with the Danish presidency giving a lot of push to this exercise, we will get by the middle of this year some quite serious proposals to improve buildings, energy efficiency, to introduce savings obligations or other ways in which we can achieve the targets. And it's essential because if you look at it beyond 2020, we need to do a lot more than a 20% improvement. We need to go to something like 30 or 40% improvement if we're serious about the low carbon economy program, and of course if we're serious about remaining competitive. Mm-hmm. And not investing too much in excessive generation capacity.
And as regards the clean energy development, one of the purposes of the initial 2020 targets was to provide investors that kind of certain level of certainty that they could get consistent government support and a certain degree of security on returns. Now, is it the case that in countries which do miss the targets and miss them by some degree, how do you then provide post-2020 some kind of security for people who would invest in, say, countries like Poland, like Greece, countries like that?
Well, the issue as to whether they meet their targets or not is a subject of concern and would be followed up by the Commission, because it would indicate a lack of commitment to the overall goals of a higher level of renewables in the system. However, I think the next question would be, well, if the targets have not been achieved, were the measures put in place not effective enough? Now, there's been a lot of experience gained in that. Tariff, feed-in tariffs, feed-in premia, other forms of obligation are to promote renewable energy. The hope, of course, and the bet in Europe is that this investment, public investment in renewables, will lead to a rollout of renewables on a large scale and a decrease in costs. Therefore, we should be able, post 2030 at least, to look at a world in which these technologies can be viable without subsidy. Otherwise, they are really unsustainable. The final question then is, do we need another set of targets or binding targets for 2030 in order to maintain that degree of predictability for investors? I think the jury is out on that. I think we don't need to decide yet. The Commissioner's view is that we would probably make some recommendation on that by the end of 2014.
And I'm sure you have seen media reports this week that the UK government is calling for any potential 2030 targets to move away from renewable energy to low carbon, including CCS, nuclear. Is that something that would receive support in the European Commission and across Europe at large?
Well, put it like this. The Commission, the European Union as a whole, is totally committed to the low carbon economy objective, and to the need for a major contribution to be made in that direction from the energy sector. Whether we need targets for any particular source of energy in the future is debatable, as I said, and maybe the markets themselves would be better to work out that on the basis of some degree of neutrality between the technologies. Nuclear is not quite in the same situation as renewables, in the sense it's not a new technology. It has been rolled out already. It has been improved considerably. What it shares with all forms of low carbon generation at the moment is the need for some degree of predictability about price long term. In the electricity and gas markets in Europe, there has been a tendency to rely less and less on long-term contracts. But for these major generation investments, it seems to us inevitable that long-term contracting is the way to go to provide that certainty for investors. And indeed, in that situation, one would expect governments to have to design schemes where at least, or perhaps with competitive tendering, it is possible to provide the public at large with electricity under such contracts.
Indeed, and between now and 2020 and beyond, as in the environment of the ongoing financial crisis, especially in Europe, how does the European Commission provide support for countries, either ones that may have been moving in well towards their 2020 targets but are now cutting back on subsidies, and ones that haven't really gotten started to begin with? How does the European Commission support continued installation of clean energy in the rest of this decade?
Well, I think it must be obvious that one of the major contributions the European Union and the Commission can make in this area is, first of all, to stabilize the financial markets and to stabilize the euro. When we have judgments by investors of a level of sovereign risk which they're not willing to carry in their investments, that's a severe obstacle to any development in the energy sector. So across the board, that is the major contribution I think we'll have to make. But of course, beyond that, in countries where the funding capacity from public sources is more limited, in the poorer countries of Eastern Europe, etc. We've proposed a new facility in the budget, Connecting Europe facility, to co-finance those investments, the investments needed at a high rate. No one's in favour of a big European budget, but I think that most people in Europe, accepting also the need to maintain some level of support for farmers, accepting too the need for other sorts of regional development measures, nevertheless could understand that energy is so important it should have a significant share of European expenditure in the budget.
Absolutely. Well, I think that wraps it up for us, but thank you very much for your time today.
Okay.